Hey scaredy cats, it's me, Scaredy Matt. Here's a question I get a lot. Hey Uggo, I never watched a horror movie before. What's a good movie to watch to get into horror? And that's a great question, though I maintain that I am quite good looking. Thing is, there's a lot of factors that go into that choice. One might be, why have you never watched a horror movie before? Because you think you're gonna be too scared? If so, do you want a movie that will be really scary? Or a movie that will ease you into the horror ecosystem gently? Or maybe you just think horror movies are dumb, in which case, do you want something that proves you wrong, or do you want a dumb movie that confirms your prejudices? The first grown-up horror movie I ever watched was Scream. Sorry if that makes some of you feel terribly old. While Scream is a great movie, as an introduction to horror, it's not great. It tends to treat horror and slasher as synonymous terms. A whole lot of movies these days take it as a given that you're familiar with the cinematic language and iconography of horror movies. Part of the impact gets lost if you're new to the genre because you haven't built up the expectations that the movie was relying on you having. Horror kind of uniquely plays with expectations. So much of making people afraid is about subversion. So things that are scary at one point become laughable over time until they're subverted and made scary again. If, for example, there was a twist in a slasher movie where the final girl character was a survivalist badass, that wouldn't be shocking to you because you hadn't seen a dozen movies where the final girl character was helpless and useless. Then you try to go back and watch those movies where the final girl is helpless and useless, and it's annoying. Stop it. So where do you get started? It's hard to say for sure, but I have a few suggestions that I'll outline here without spoiling anything. All 5 are great movies for very different reasons, and at least one of them ought to give you what you're looking for. Let's just get this one out of the way. The classics are the classics for a reason. John Carpenter's Halloween isn't the first slasher, but it's the gold standard that every other slasher has lived in the shadow of ever since. The story is as simple as it gets. There's a masked killer prowling the streets of a suburban street on Halloween night. A few teens find themselves being picked off one by one. That's it, that's all. What more do you need? What sets Halloween apart from its peers is the atmosphere. The rad synth music, the way they nail the look of mid-autumn despite filming in May, the performances from Donald Pleasance and Jamie Lee Curtis, the subtle, quiet sense of menace that builds throughout the movie. Halloween is a bit slow and a bit tame by modern standards. Not a lot happens, but there's a reason the franchise has endured over 11 movies and 3 series reboots. To watch any slasher movie which came afterwards without having watched Halloween is to watch it without context. Oh, also, you should know, going into this movie, Michael Myers, the film villain, does eat a dog. I know people are sensitive to animals being killed in movies, so just letting you know, there is a shot in this movie of a partially eaten dog. Don't worry, I'm not just gonna stack the whole list with John Carpenter movies. I could do that, because he made a lot of very good movies. I don't think it's controversial to say that The Thing is probably his best work. The movie is about a group of researchers in the Arctic who come into contact with an alien creature that can perfectly imitate anything that it eats. This movie has the best creature effects of any movie that's been made on planet Earth, full stop. It is the high watermark for creature effects. There is no other movie that even comes close. But the fact that it does that better than any other movie is almost incidental to why The Thing is brilliant. Because what truly sets it apart is the sense of paranoia it cultivates in the audience. You never know who is and who is not the Thing, and even if they're not, they might be cracking under the pressure, or they might think someone else is the Thing. Any character could be a threat at any time, and everyone else is surrounded at all times with thousands of miles of icy death in all directions. There's nowhere to go, and there's nobody to trust. Oh yeah, and if the Thing gets out, it could infect and kill every living being on the planet, so you know, no pressure. Oh, also, just a word of warning, a group of dogs do get killed in this movie, so just know that, going in, John Carpenter hates dogs. Probably seems pretty strange that I'm recommending the second movie in a franchise as the first horror movie you should watch. Thing is, Evil Dead 2 is part remake and part sequel. It retells the events of Evil Dead in its opening 10 minutes, and watching them both back to back often leaves new viewers confused. It's not at all necessary to watch Evil Dead to enjoy Evil Dead 2. In fact, I think it probably helps not to have watched Evil Dead. They're extremely different tonally. Evil Dead is a grimy, sadistic cheapo horror made mostly by amateurs. It's more charming than effective at what it's trying to do, and I say that as someone who loves it to bits. Evil Dead 2 is a much more polished movie made later in Sam Raimi's career, and it shows. The story follows a group of college students who go to an old rundown cabin in the woods for a weekend. Always a great choice. They find a cursed book with the power to raise the dead. Evil Dead 2 is much sillier than the original, going from straight horror to horror comedy without ever losing its edge. Bruce Campbell gives a career-defining performance, with some stellar physical comedy and moments of satirical machismo that are almost impossible to dislike. This is one of the most quotable movies you'll ever see in your life, and chances are after you watch it, you'll look at some other movie or TV show or video game and go, "Oh, that's where they got that." There's no other word for Evil Dead 2: Dead by Dawn than fun. It has this manic energy that never quite lets up. It moves seamlessly between scares and laughs, and it's impossible to predict what's going to happen moment to moment. It might not be the most frightening movie you'll ever see, though it's certainly no slouch in that department, but it's a really good time either way. Stop me if you've heard this one before. A guy wakes up from a coma to find that the hospital and the major metropolitan city he lives in this case, London, abandoned. Everywhere there are signs of an apocalyptic struggle, and when he finally finds other people, turns out they're a mindless horde of zombies. And yeah, they're zombies. I'm not going to relitigate this tiresome debate. They are zombies. Just live with it. You might recognize this as the plot of the first episode of The Walking Dead, except in Atlanta rather than London. 28 Days Later did it first, but you really shouldn't be mad at The Walking Dead for lifting that part, because 28 Days Later is kind of like a greatest hits collection of the zombie movies that came before it. Don't get me wrong, it's inventive too. There are certainly fresh ideas in 28 Days Later, but a lot of the material on screen was done elsewhere. That shouldn't matter to you though, because this is your first horror movie, so you haven't seen those. It's all new to you. 28 Days Later is alternatingly grim and hopeful, a raw, unflinching glimpse into how catastrophe can bring out the worst in people, but also how building a community helps us get through hard times. There's a pervasive sense of danger throughout the whole movie that's helped enormously by some of the best zombie acting that's ever been in a movie. Zombies in 28 Days Later aren't like your typical slow-walking moan lords. These guys run, jump, and they friggin' hate you. They just hate your guts. They want to fuck you up. They're real mad. And most of the main ones are portrayed by professional dancers, so they move in this really creepy, emotive way that really adds to the scares. Be warned though, there is a great deal of implied sexual assault in the later parts of the movie. If that's something you're sensitive to, probably skip this one and instead watch Return of the Living Dead, which is tonally the exact opposite of 28 Days Later, but it's a hell of a lot of fun. For my money, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is probably the most effective horror movie ever made. I grew up dismissing this movie because the title and the name Leatherface gave me the impression that it was some mindless gore fest. It is the furthest thing from that. In fact, there's very little violence shown on screen. It just manages to convince you somehow that there is. Seriously, ask people who've seen it how violent the movie is, and they'll tell you it's real violent. Then watch it, and you'll notice that the majority of the violence is implied, leaving you more disgusted and upset than had it been shown. This movie is a nightmare where it feels like the universe itself has suddenly become hostile to the protagonists. The laws of nature gradually erode until all that is left is bleak, all-consuming madness, like a rotting carcass, starting structured but giving in to entropy, bit by bit. It starts slow and builds to an unforgettable climax. If you haven't seen it, forget everything you think you know about it. Even the stuff I'm saying now, forget all of it. Just write down somewhere to watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre and erase all of your memories. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is an example of the best the genre has to offer. If you don't like horror movies and you watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre and don't like it, fair dues. You've given the genre a fair shake, and I'm not going to be mad at you for deciding it's not for you. So that's my list. 5 great movies to start you off. Not necessarily a top 5, just 5 movies that should get your noodles stirring at what else the genre has to offer. Each of these movies comes with a long line of influences and movies that were influenced by them. All of them have sequels, though, quite honestly, aside from Evil Dead 2 and a couple Halloweens, I wouldn't really bother with any of them. Point is, if you watch and like any of them, it's a seam to discover a ton of other similar movies. But what do you think? What would you start people off with? Comment below. And for once, I'm not just saying that to cynically benefit myself in the YouTube algorithm. I genuinely want to know. This is a really interesting question. If people like this and they find themselves going through all 5 movies and wanting more suggestions, I might do another one of these. Who knows? This was fun. I'm having fun here on YouTube.com. If you had fun, press the like button, please, and subscribe for more videos every Tuesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.